Voters decide an unprecedented election in Colorado for the first time in at least 100 years. There are 3 open congressional seats. Representatives Kim Buck and Doug Lamborn retired. Lauren Boebert switched from Congressional District 3 to Congressional District 4. Republican Jeff Hurd and Democrat Adam Frisch are vying for her seat in Congressional District 3, which spans the western slope to Pueblo and Trinidad. Hurd is an attorney and native of Grand Junction. Frisch is a business owner and former Aspen City Councilman. In an effort to help you, the voters, make informed decisions, your political reporter Sean Boyd did in-depth interviews with both candidates.
I am joined today by Adam Frisch, the Democratic candidate in CD3.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Thanks for driving up here for this. So I want to start out with farming. It is such a big issue in Congressional District 3. One of the issues that farmers are facing is the lack of workers. How would you address the undocumented farm workers, but then also the H-2A visa program?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for talking about that. Not everyone probably knows that of our 8 congressional districts, CD3 is the only one that doesn't touch any part of the metro Denver County area. So we truly are the only really truly rural district in our state. Just to remind everyone, it's pretty much the entire San Luis Valley, Pueblo, and all the way up the western slope. So both southern Colorado and western slope rely on farming, ag, ranching. But in addition to that workforce shortage, we also have healthcare centers. There's a big shortage of healthcare workers in southern and western Colorado as well. You know, all the people that, the vast majority of people are still employing H-2A documented workers. They come up here, they seem to be very happy. They come back on an annual and yearly basis. But when I'm driving around, and I've driven 70,000 miles, I'm on the road 25 days a month for the past 2 years, this is the number one concern I have. They want the border fixed, they want it secure, but they certainly want it fixed, and making sure that there are more opportunities for legal people working here, and that's something that's really, really important. It's been a really long time since we've seen an increase in the H-2A visa program, and that's something that I'd love to work on in Congress. And whether it goes through the Farm Bill, which sadly keeps on getting delayed, which is hurting southern Colorado, western Colorado, and the United States of America, we'd have to figure out how to have a better labor source.
So how also can Congress work to open up more foreign markets for farmers? There are a lot of farms that produce more food than they can use.
Yeah, you know, Mexico is now our largest trading partner agriculturally. I was just actually down in the border. I went down there a couple weeks ago to McAllen, Texas, to kind of get a lay of the land. We didn't bring down a big you know, film crew or anything. We just wanted to go visit and have some conversations, talk to some of the farmers that actually have land on both sides of the border, and they just talked about as well how important it is to have an orderly and secure border to make sure that agriculture and the workforce can go back, and it's really, really important. One of the things we have to be careful about is tariffs. When there were blanket tariffs 4 or 5 years ago, the United States agricultural industry suffered $30 billion in losses, and so we have to make sure that we're very strategic about how we do taxes domestically as well as international and foreign trade, because there's a lot of great things that are happening in southern and western Colorado, and we want to have markets available to everywhere we can.
You mentioned the Farm Bill. It did come out of the House Agriculture Committee, but it also cut nearly $30 billion in SNAP benefits. Would you support a Farm Bill like that?
Well, I mean, I think I need to look at it. I mean, it's thousands of pages. We need to pass something. You know, there's 2 parts of the Farm Bill. One is the SNAP benefits, which is a revised name for basically the food stamp, to make sure that people that can't afford that have that. But also it's really important to make sure that there is a domestic, strong, and secure food industry. And those funds go in there to support our domestic food industry. We do not want to be reliant on we do not want to be reliant on international energy, nor do we want to be reliant on international food. But we are now I think we are now importing twice the amount of vegetables and produce we were a couple years ago. So we need to figure out how to make sure that we produce more that we can too, and we can sell it into that standpoint. So, you know, to me, there's a consumer aspect to life, and there's a producer aspect, and we're very, very focused in western and southern Colorado on the producers. And so the more that we can produce, the more people have a chance to eat, and the more there is out there, we should have lower food costs, which is something that we all need to do because everybody's struggling.
Now, you've talked a lot about the water issue,
Yeah.
and that is huge in CD3. What can you do to prevent water from leaving rural areas like the San Luis Valley and flowing to those urban areas?
No, thanks. I mean, I think, Sean, this is one of our top issues, without a doubt. It has been perennial. I don't see a lot of partisanship in it all whatsoever. You just want to find people that are actually going to focus on that. You know, I've said before when I give water talks, sometimes I wear a CD3 hat, sometimes I wear a Colorado hat, and sometimes I wear this Upper Basin hat, which is Colorado's part of one of 4 states in the 7-state conversation that's going back 100 years. And I try to wear all 3 hats as much as possible, but sometimes I need to wear a CD3 hat with all due respect to the rest of Colorado. And that is to make sure that as we try to tackle Colorado's water shortage, we do not solve it 100% on the back of the western slope in southern Colorado. And obviously water is near and dear to the San Luis Valley. And my opponent is backed by the biggest lobbyist of renewable water resources, which is solely and clearly focused on getting as much water out of the San Luis Valley as possible. And I just don't want that to happen. And that's something that we're spending a lot of time making sure that those farmers and ranchers and conservationists and energy producers have the water that they need in the San Luis Valley.
So, do you think energy is another big issue in CD3? Do you think any form of energy should receive incentive subsidies?
Well, I mean, I think we need to figure out how to have an all of the above, and I mean that's really, really importantly. What's really, really heartbreaking from the United States, and especially the state capitol, is this desire to see reliable and renewable, as well as traditional energy sources, being chased out of the United States and being chased out of the western slope and a little bit in southern Colorado. Listen, we have a 150-year-old steel mill. It's 80% solar powered. It's the only solar powered steel mill in the world. That's a great story. But Colorado produces some of the cleanest and most reliable natural gas there is. And when we are shutting that down, we're not getting solar power from Sweden, and we're not getting wind power from Denmark. We are actually asking Iran and Venezuela and Russia and China to backfill really clean and reliable energy sources, and affordability is something that's really important and goes across everywhere. And we need to figure out a way to make sure that our domestic energy source, especially in western and southern Colorado, stay plentiful. And so coming up with those situations, then we can kind of figure out what type of boosts other industries really need. I prefer the free market as much as possible, but I do not want for us in the United States or our allies over in Europe pushing back against Putin to figure out how that they were pushing back against Putin at the same time we're asking Russia to bail out the energy sources of our neighbors and our allies. And that's something that's really disruptive to the global economy. We're not going to do that on national security. And it's going to be bad for our climate, because things that are produced here are much cleaner than they are produced over in Iran and Venezuela and China.
Do you support the Inflation Reduction Act, and are there any provisions in the IRA that you would roll back?
Well, listen, I mean, I think when you're, sadly, both parties are to blame for this. Instead of trying to figure out how to tackle what used to be 12 different focused budgeting bills, everything gets thrown at the very end, and you start to have these multi-trillion-dollar budget bills. And so, yeah, in almost every bill, there's things I wish were in there, and there's things I wish there weren't. But life is about making decisions, and leadership's about making hard decisions, and you got to weigh the good and the bad to try to figure it out. So the exciting parts about the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think I'm not sure was the most honest name for something, but it did provide a lot of resources for traditional energy sources as well as for some of our renewable, and we need all of the above. And the fact we're going to see a lot more solar in southern and western Colorado is really good. There's not a lot of wind opportunity down there, but I do want to make a pitch for the largest wind manufacturing for the turbines in the wind towers. They are down in Pueblo as well, and so there's a lot of great heavy industrial work going on, real work, real manufacturing, that is doing things for the next generation of energy sources, and I think that's really important.
What additional climate policies would you support, and are there any that you would eliminate?
Well, I wrote an op-ed and made it very, very clear that the White House wanted to ban further liquid natural gas, LNG export facilities. And I think it's one of the dumbest things ever for the global climate. I think it's one of the dumbest things ever for our national security. And it's obviously horrible for the economies of Colorado and Texas and the rest of the United States. And it goes back to the whole thing is we need a certain amount of energy and power to be used as we are in the United States as well as in the world. We need to figure out what we're producing with what types of sectors and try to figure out what sectors do we want to boost up. But just because the United States decides to get out of liquid natural gas exports, it doesn't mean everywhere else in the world's going to flip a switch and we're going to be on solar and we're going to be on wind. We need base load, reliable, efficient and renewable energy, as well as we're going to have some transition energies for a long time. I think whale blubber is the only energy source that we've actually truly gotten off in the past 300 years. And so I just wish that there was the math, that people understood the math of the energy sector.
A lot of people try and see it as black and white,
Yeah.
and I don't think it is.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
No. Let's talk about your budget priorities. You know, Democrats often call for tax increases on corporations and the wealthy, which is defined, I think, by the Biden administration as making more than $400,000. Do you support that? And what are your top priorities in negotiating a new tax framework when the 2017 tax cuts expire next year?
So both parties are to blame for this whole thing. I mean, as I say, neither party has a monopoly on good ideas, and both parties have some really, really horrible ideas. And both parties are responsible for $35 trillion in debt. We have a $2 trillion deficit just on an annual basis. 30 years ago, we actually had a little bit of a surplus. We need to figure out over the long haul. It's not going to be done in 7 months or 7 years, but we have to figure out how to kind of change that cost curve and try to figure out where we can get revenues. You know, my view is that any additional revenues I want to see to go towards paying off that debt and deficit, because you don't run your family business like that. You do not. People in southern and western Colorado are not running their family budgets like that or their business budgets like that. So I'm a big believer that we need to hold the revenues on the middle class, the true middle class, and try to figure out where we can generate the money that we're going to need. You know, economic growth is the best way to produce, to close budget gaps. And so my view from a tax standpoint and revenue standpoint and spending standpoint is let's set up a framework where we're going to encourage a lot of growth. And while big business is employing 50% of the people in this country, the vast, vast majority of southern and western Colorado workers are small business owners. And so I'm not really that focused on what a Fortune 500 company is going to be paying or what the private equity companies in New York City are paying, because the vast majority of people is how do we support entrepreneurship, small businesses, agricultural, ranching, farming, domestic energy. Those are the things that I want to figure out how to spur growth. Generate the revenue that we need to provide the services that we all use, no matter what people think. Everyone's using government services. We need to have infrastructure. We need to have roads. And so that's what I want to do is how do we focus on the CD3 tax policy as opposed to kind of the big headlines about what a Fortune 500 company or what a billionaire is going to pay. That's not really my focus.
Would you support a constitutional balanced budget amendment?
That puts us into in a real bad situation, I think. I think everything needs to be on the table when you're $35 trillion in the debt. Yeah. And I do hope when I am in Congress in January, I'm happy to partake in these bicameral Senate and House and listen, I'm called brave and dumb all the time. I say what I say and what I believe, and whether I'm Telluride or Durango or whether I'm in Rangeley or Moffat County, I'm just there to make sure I can share what I truly believe is the next thing we need. But we definitely have a debt and deficit problem, and we need to have everything on the table. But we want to be careful about the constitutional amendment stuff.
Social Security and Medicare are in trouble, according to the trustees. What would you do to maintain their solvency? Yeah,
there's a lot of things where I say, well, the crisis is not tomorrow. We are on an unsustainable path. And my understanding is if we do not change the path now, in 10 or 11 years, there's going to be something like a 20 or 21% cost reduction automatically. So to say that nobody wants to change anything, you're actually just defaulting to a 20% drop. And I do not want that to happen. People have paid a lot of money into that. There's been a responsibility and a promise from everybody to try to figure out how to do that. So again, we're going to have to figure out where we're going to have the right amount of revenues and the right amount of spending and try to figure out how the Social Security can last in perpetuity. Do you raise the retirement age? Do you means test Social Security? Well, I mean, again, I think there's like 25 different moving parts about that stuff. Again, we need to figure out, and all sides need to be on the table, that in 20 years, in 10 years, we're going to have a 20% drop, and so we have to figure out how to have some real serious conversations. Do you support work requirements for federal assistance programs? Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful for those that have families, because I think we just realized that when you talk about a recipient of a program, you're talking about a mom or a dad or a bunch of kids, and we certainly don't want to do anything to hurt families and hurt kids. And so I think that there are ways to have some type of work requirements, but we also have to realize that raising a family is the most important work there is. So cost of living is, of course, a huge issue. Number one all the time. Right now, right. Do you, there's a lot of talk about these anti-price gouging policies to lower grocery bills. Do you think
that would help, or what steps would you take to make sure that inflation doesn't shoot up again?
Again, pox in both houses for both parties for just spending willy-nilly. And the government spending that's gone out of control is certainly adding to the inflation. We're still getting out of some of the supply chain chokes from some of the post-COVID thing, even though it's been a couple years. We have to figure about that. Price gouging is a hard conversation. What I would say is that farmers used to make 30 cents for every dollar spent in agriculture in 1980, and now they're making less than 10 cents. And so this is the conversation of the industrialization and the monopolization of agriculture and energy. We need to figure out to have more small business owners have a chance to add to the supply. And it's not just the demand. We need to figure out how to make sure, and we're very, very proud. Unlike my opponent, we're not taking any corporate PAC money. We want to ban stock trading from Congress, and we've signed term limit pledges. And without a doubt, there's just too much corporate money influencing people. And as I tell people, with all due respect, they're not giving people corporate PAC money, and they're not trying to give me corporate PAC money because I'm a great dad, which I am, or a great guy, which I also am. They're trying to figure out how to get influence, and we need to get corporate influence out of the system for a lot of reasons, and part of that is the increase in prices and the regulations.
When we talk cost of living, healthcare is always a part of that. How should the government curb the growth of its healthcare spending programs while maintaining or improving quality?
Yeah. Child care, healthcare, affordable housing, which I spent a lot of time working on, and obviously grocery prices. Those are 3 or 4 of the things that everybody's really talking about. And for someone who was born in Fort Peck Indian Reservation in northeastern Montana, my dad was the Indian Health Service for 5 years, that we have to figure out how to get more supply of physicians and physicians' assistants and doctors and nurses. A lot of people in CD3, we have more in common with rural Tennessee than we do with Denver when it comes to healthcare. And part of the problem is, and again, it goes back to this corporate conversation loop in, is that there's not enough competition in the insurance markets outside of the big cities, and there's not a lot of competition for healthcare providers. And I've attended the last 3 Western Healthcare Alliances out in Grand Junction, where 30 CEOs get together and talk about it, and whether they're in liberal or conservative districts and hospital districts, everyone is talking about some of the same concerns. And I've met with 15 of them individually, and we're really trying to figure out how to drive down the cost curve.
What Medicare for all? Is that
No.
something? No.
I'll say this. This is a theme I have all the time. There's all these national conversations going on. I want to get on a subcommittee and a committee and work with other Western representatives and senators, Republicans and Democrats, to focus on the rural aspects of healthcare, the rural aspects of housing. These really big national things, a lot of people spend time on it. We're not going to move the needle. So I want to focus on what is going to directly affect ranchers and farmers.
Rural hospitals are struggling in Colorado.
Big time.
Yeah, we've got 43 of them. Half of them are in the red. Should the federal government help them?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be careful about saying help. We need to make sure that healthcare access is available to people. We do not want to say just because you're in this zip code or that zip code, you get healthcare or you don't. And we need to figure out, again, the rural aspects of it, how to figure out how to make sure between the insurance companies, the hospitals, and then you have the pharmaceutical industry. And we need to figure out how to work with all 3 of those to make sure that people are staying healthy. And the amount of people in our district that are $600 or $700 away from really, really big emergency financial distress by those unplanned healthcare things are really important. And we need to figure out how to keep our hospitals. A lot of our hospitals are operating on 1 or 2% margins, and that's a really scary place to be for them as well.
Do you think that the minimum wage should be increased? And what about the tipped minimum wage?
You know, it seems to be that we're in loony season at the presidential level, and I don't spend a lot of time talking about it, but it seems like whatever off-the-cuff comment, both parties seem to be throwing things out there. You know, I think there's some interesting conversations about supporting and increasing the child credit, which I think is an interesting conversation we had. But, you know, the problem, and for someone who worked in waiting tables and back waiting in high school and in college and my first year in New York City, I fully understand the hospitality and the F&B business. But the problem is, all of a sudden, you would start to see hedge fund managers that would be getting tipped in their bonuses. And so we have to be very, very careful. We need to sit down and have a serious conversation after this election about how do we set up a tax structure that provides economic growth. And again, for me, how do we supply rural small businesses to make sure that they can thrive?
So what role do you think the government should have in establishing workplace policies like sick days, paid family and medical leave?
Listen, I'm a big believer. I'm pro-worker and pro-union and pro-labor. And I think one of the interesting things that's happened over the past decade or so is you're starting to see Republicans, not just Democrats, trying to figure out how to support the workforces. That is the lifeblood of where we are as American. People are starting to realize that. And, you know, to me, the states should figure this conversation out. It's interesting. The states have put on a bunch of minimum wage ballots, and they've passed every single time, including in some of the most Republican states. So I prefer the federal government to stay away from as much as possible and let the states kind of make those conversations. So if the states want to raise minimum wage, good for them. If they don't, that's up to them, and then the workforce can kind of figure out how to do it. But to me, the wages are just part of a pro-worker conversation to make sure that the dignity of work with a college education or not is honored and supported in Western and Southern Colorado.
We started out by talking a little bit about immigration in relation to farming. What would be overall your immigration priorities? Is it finishing the wall, the Stay in Mexico program, merit-based visa?
Yeah.
What?
As I mentioned, we were just down there a couple weeks ago trying to get a lay of the land down there. And the number one thing I took away is that 30 or 40 years ago, the last time we actually had immigration laws put in place, there were individual people making individual decisions about coming over and going back. Now, there's basically a human trafficking industrial complex that is just being really, really destructive. But so whether these human traffickers or these cartels, whether they're running marijuana, whether they're running fentanyl, or whether they're running people, sadly, they don't really care. And so that's just something that I learned probably more than being down there, which is really, really helpful. So we need to figure out how to secure the border. I've made it very, very clear I would have signed the Senator Langford from Oklahoma's bill. I think that's a great bill to hold us in place for a year or two to figure out how to kind of control the border, secure the border. But without a doubt, we need to figure out how do we have more legal workers coming in here. And there is a way for us to be strict in a country of laws and put order in place and still be humane. And the one theme that I think people don't like is the unfairness and the chaos. And once that calms down, we can have some other conversations about the dreamers and some of those young kids that were born in the United States because their parents came over here, and try to figure out how to make sure that they're already involved in our communities, they're already involved in our schools, they're already involved in our churches. We need to formalize that conversation. But until the border starts to get more secure, it's going to be really hard to have those conversations. But as we started off, there's an economic driver to the immigration conversation, and I wish more of the Chamber of Commerce organizations were playing a role, as opposed to kind of the far sides of both sides getting into kind of the identity aspect to the immigration thing. And I think there's some really great economic agreements that we can bring people together to work on something that is calm and orderly and fair.
On abortion, do you support taxpayer funding for abortion?
So let me say two things, and I'll get to that. One is, if men can get pregnant, this conversation would never started 100 years ago. So that's number one. Two, under no circumstance along this 9-month pregnancy is the woman going to make a worse decision than politicians. And I appreciate some people are talking about state rights, and I appreciate people don't want the federal government overriding women, but I don't understand why they want state politicians to override women. And so the number one aspect to me is that the women need to be left to make up their own decisions. And I say that as a father of an OBGYN. I say that as a brother of an OBGYN as well. And I think it's just really important to do that. You know, to me, we have publicly funded healthcare options, and I don't see why reproductive rights should not be part of that conversation. And I go back to, if men could get pregnant, this conversation would have been solved 100 years ago.
Right. Gun control. Do you support any new gun control?
Yeah. So, you know, I think our district, I'd let people know the Second Amendment is probably we're probably a top 5 county in the country. For that, out of the 3,100 counties, it's really important, and I fully support the Second Amendment. Where I'm focused on is making sure I'm less concerned about what someone has in their hand versus who has something in their hand. And to me, when we focus on just some type of narrow gun ban, and they change it by 0.001%, it doesn't do anything. There's a mental health crisis out there. More than almost 60% of all gun deaths are suicides. Yeah. And so we need to figure out how to keep guns out of people that shouldn't be having them, whatever the gun is. And so that's, to me, is something that's really, really important. So, you know, the safe storage laws are really important, educational training. I know there's some background checks which are in place, which is also very helpful. But again, everything I want to do is focused on who has a gun in their hand versus what type of gun they might have, because at the end of the day, that's how we're going to reduce it. And I did make the comment that I'm supportive of the bipartisan legislation that was put into place about 2 years ago. You had 10 Republican senators, including Cornyn from Texas, who's a pretty conservative guy, and Texas is obviously pro-Second Amendment as well, which I support. So I think those are the ways that we work on that. Just this mental health crisis. Our farmers and our ranchers, Sean, are starting to surpass veterans in suicide rates. And we have all three of those populations are really important for CD3.
Lastly, I want to touch on foreign policy. What do you believe the role of the U.S. should be in achieving peace in the Middle East?
Yeah. And so, well, I've been in the Western Slope for 20 years. I did spend 10 or 11 years in New York City. As I said, I went out there waiting tables and ended up getting into international finance. So I've been to 40 or 50 countries, and I've done business in over 40 or 50, Asia and Middle East and Africa. And so, you know, listen, to me, I think it's really important that the United States gets a lot of benefit for being one of the true superpowers. And I would argue the only superpower economically as well as military. And one of the best ways that we can protect our country is to make sure that we have a humble but strong presence in foreign policy conversations. We have not always been the most humble about it, but there are economic reasons, especially for Western and Southern Colorado, that we want to make sure that we have a strong shield to internationally to the Republic, to make sure that we have a strong domestic thing at home. And so I think it's really important that we stay involved because if we're not there, we're going to see a lot more people from Russia and a lot more influence from China. And I think the world's better off, and the United States, most importantly, is much better off if the U.S. has a strong but humble conversation on the foreign stage.
Lastly, are NATO countries spending enough on their defense budgets, do you think?
No, listen, I would say one of the, I think one of the good things that came out of Donald Trump's presidency was he did a much better job of trying to hold our allies to some monetary conversations. And I know that there's this ask to have them be investing 2 or 3%. And I think the first thing we have to do is go around and make sure every once in a while that they actually are honoring that. And if we want to get together with NATO, which to me is one of the most important things we've done in the past 50, 60, 70 years as a country, to provide the stability that we need to make sure that we're not sending more men and more women from the United States in harm's way. But we also have to make sure that there's this fairness conversation. And I think for a long time, NATO was, I want to be careful about saying free riding, but they weren't probably paying what I think a lot of us believe is their fair share. And I'm glad they're starting to put that money in there now.
All right, we've touched on a lot. Anything I've missed that you would want to add?
I just want to say thank you. You know, again, the conversation I'm having, with all due respect to my friends in Denver, is that there's a rural-urban divide going on out there. But to me, it's about a consumer and a producer standpoint. And the vast majority of our 27 counties in our district come from a production side, and the producers have kind of been left out of that conversation in D.C. and especially in Denver. So I'm here just to be a pro-producer candidate, and that's what we're running on. I'm very excited about our momentum going forward, and I appreciate you making time for us.
Well, I appreciate you coming in.
Thanks
Thank you very
much.
much.